The scream was what did it, that sharp, jagged sound that cuts right through a humid July morning like a rusty blade, and before I even dropped my coffee mug, I knew my peace in Oak Creek Estates was officially dead. I sprinted toward the driveway, lungs burning, only to see my custom-built, midnight blue Raptor ATV flipped on its side like a dying beetle, its wheels still spinning with a pathetic whirring sound that made my stomach do a slow roll. Then I saw the stroller, a mangled mess of aluminum and fabric lying 5 feet away, and for a second, my heart just stopped beating because the world went silent, except for the frantic sobbing of a young mother kneeling in the grass. Neighbors started spilling out of their pristine colonial homes like ants from a disturbed hill. And there, tangled in a row of thorned barberry bushes as she just plowed through, was Chloe Vance, the 19-year-old daughter of our HOA president, looking less like a victim and more like a brat who'd finally run out of luck. Her mother, Diane Vance, didn't end oppose. T just walk onto the scene. She arrived like a thunderstorm, a woman who carried her authority like a blunt instrument and used her position as the HOA chair to treat our neighborhood like her private fiefdom. Diane was the kind of person who'd measure your grass with a ruler at 6 a.m. just to feel something. A woman who lived for the gotcha moment. And as she thundered across the pavement, her eyes wearing into oppos, T on the upside-down stroller or the terrified mother, they were fixed on me. She didn't ask if the baby was okay. She didn't check if the neighbors were hurt. She just pointed a shaking finger at the wreckage and bellowed, "What did you do to my daughter in oppos? Vehicle," And that's when I realized the madness went deeper than I ever imagined, because Chloe hadn't in oppos. T just taken my ATV for a joyride. She'd stolen it for a reason that was about to pull the mask off the entire board of Oak Creek. I moved here with my wife, Sarah, about 2 years ago, thinking we'd found the American dream, a quiet cul-de-sac where I could spend my weekends in the garage restoring old engines, which is my therapy, my way of tuning out the noise of a corporate job. But Oak Creek didn't want harmony. It wanted compliance, and Diane Vance was the high priestess of that religion, a woman who'd spend her afternoons patrolling in a custom golf cart, peering into windows and taking notes on, unauthorized patio furniture, or improper mulch depth, My first run-in with her was over a bird feeder that was apparently 2 inches too high, and she'd stood there, breathing heavy, smelling of expensive perfume and cheap malice, telling me that, standards are what separate us from the animals, And I should have known then that she was a predator. She'd raised Chloe to be exactly like her, a girl who walked through life thinking every sidewalk was a red carpet and every rule was just a suggestion for the little people, And I caught them both looking at my garage more than once, their eyes lingering on the blue Raptor I'd spent 6 months and $4,000 rebuilding from frame. 2 weeks before the crash, things got weird when I received a notice of intent to impound for a vehicle that wasn't in oppos. Even on the street, claiming I was violating a bylaw about unsightly mechanical equipment, even though the ATV was tucked behind a locked door. I remember standing on my porch, looking at Diane as she scribbled on a clipboard, and I asked her how she even knew what was in my garage, and she just gave me this tight, shark-like smile and said, "A community is only as strong as its surveillance, dear," And that's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I'd installed a magnetic key box on the underside of a metal workbench near the garage door, a stupid habit from my grandfather, and I'd noticed Chloe lingering near my driveway a few days later, her phone out, filming me like I was a zoo exhibit. I thought she was just being a nuisance, a bored kid with too much entitlement and not enough hobbies, but I didn't in oppos. T realized she was scouting the target, and I certainly didn't in oppos. T realized that her mother had already decided my property belonged to the HOA. The morning of the theft was supposed to be a celebration. I'd finally finished the tuning. The engine sounded like a purring cat, and I'd left the garage door cracked a few inches to let the heat out while I went inside to grab a bottle of water. I saw the alert on my phone, a motion sensor trigger, and when I pulled up the live feed, my blood turned to ice as I watched Chloe Vance slide under the door with the grace of a practiced thief, walk straight to the workbench, and pop that magnetic box open like she'd practiced it 100 times. She didn't in oppos. T looked scared. She looked bored. checking her reflection in the chrome of the handlebars before she hopped on, fired it up, and tore out of my driveway with a screech of tires that left black marks on my pristine concrete. I ran out just as her ponytail disappeared around the corner of Willow Lane, and I knew right then that I wasn't an oppos. T just dealing with a delinquent. I was dealing with a family business. Sarah was already on the phone with 911 while I hopped into my truck. Not to chase her like some action hero, but to keep eyes on the asset, and I watched through the windshield as Chloe drove like a maniac, blowing through stop signs and weaving onto sidewalks while holding her phone up to record a, end quote, story, end quote. She was laughing, I could see in the side mirror, a 19-year-old girl who'd been told her whole life that her mother's name was a shield, and she was heading straight for the back entrance of the neighborhood, near the HOA equipment sheds. I told the dispatcher exactly where she was, but Chloe didn't into oppos. T make it to the sheds because she tried to take the Crestwood turn at 40 miles an hour. The tires gripped, the weight shifted, and the world turned upside down in a chorus of screaming metal and tearing fabric. When the dust settled at the crash site, the horror of it really sank in because that stroller sheet clip belonged to Megan, a neighbor whose baby was only 6 months old, and by some miracle, some absolute act of God, the stroller had tipped away from the impact rather than under it. The baby was screaming, Megan was hyperventilating, and Chloe was sitting in the bushes, her designer leggings torn, crying about how her wrist hurt while her mother tried to block the police from taking photos of the scene. Diane was actually shouting at the officers, telling them her daughter had a, and quote, pre-existing anxiety condition, end quote, that made her, end quote, confused about property boundaries, end quote, and she actually produced a laminated card that claimed Chloe was exempt from certain local ordinances. The officer, a veteran named Miller who looked like he'd seen enough nonsense for 3 lifetimes, just looked at the card, looked at Diane, and said, end quote, Mon oppos, this is a library card with a sticker on it. Please step back before I arrest you for obstruction, end quote. The ATV was towed, Chloe was taken to the hospital in handcuffs, and for a few hours, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing for the first time in a decade, but the real rot started coming to light that evening when Sarah and I sat down to look at the AirTag history I'd hidden in the seat of the Raptor. It didn't in oppos. T just showed the theft. It showed that the ATV had stopped for 3 minutes behind the HOA maintenance building 2 days prior when I was at work and when Sarah started digging into the, end quote, community first, end quote, Facebook group Diane ran, we found something sickening. There were dozens of posts about, end quote, abandoned, end quote, or, end quote, non-compliant, end quote, vehicles being, end quote, voluntarily surrendered, end quote, to the HOA, and when we looked at the names of the people who'd lost their property, they were all residents who had dared to vote against Diane in the last board election. It was a racket, a sophisticated tow and ransom scheme where Diane would declare a vehicle a, end quote, nuisance, end quote, have her daughter or the, end quote, security, end quote, guy, a creep named Garrett, end quote, collect, end quote, it, and then charge the owners a $600, end quote, processing fee, end quote, to get it back from an undisclosed location. I knew I couldn't into oppos. T just go to the police with a theory. I needed them to walk into the trap themselves, so the next night I pulled my old beat-up project bike, a rusted-out frame that looked like junk but still had a working engine, onto the edge of my lawn. I draped a tarp over it, making it look like I was trying to hide a, end quote, violation, end quote, and I sat in my darkened living room with Detective Miller on speakerphone while Sarah monitored the 4 high-def cameras I'd tucked into the eaves of the house. Around 11 p.m., a white pickup truck with no plates rolled slowly down the street, and out stepped Garrett, the HOA's, end quote, compliance officer, end quote, carrying a heavy-duty winch cable and looking around like a burglar in a cartoon. He didn't in oppos. To even check the house, he just started hooking the cable to the frame, and when I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, he didn't in oppos. To run, he just smirked and told me I was, end quote, interfering with a lawful seizure under Bylaw 14, end quote. End quote. There's no Bylaw 14, Garrett, end quote. I said, my voice steady even though my heart was hammering against my ribs, and he just took 2 steps toward me, puffing out his chest, and shoved me hard enough that I hit the siding of the house, end quote. Diane says there is, end quote. He growled, end quote. And Diane is the law in this zip code. So go back inside before you have an accident like the last guy, end quote. That was the magic word. The assault was on camera, the threat was recorded, and 3 unmarked police cruisers tore around the corner, lights flashing, pinning the pickup truck against the curb before Garrett could even reach for his door. He folded like a card table, crying about how he was just, and quote, following orders, and quote, and that Diane had promised him a cut of the, and quote, processing fees, and quote, if he could clear 10 vehicles a month. But the real kicker, the thing that felt like a movie script, happened the next morning when Miller called me to say that the primary evidence, the SD card from my porch camera that showed the shove, had, and quote, disappeared, and quote, from the evidence locker at the station. My heart dropped, thinking Diane's reach went all the way into the precinct, but Miller sounded almost giddy when he told me they'd checked the security footage at the station and saw Diane herself, who'd come in to, and quote, drop off paperwork, and quote, lingering near the intake desk. They got a warrant for her house within the hour, and they didn't into Oppos. T found the card in a safe or a drawer. They found it in the bottom of her handbag, tucked inside a compact mirror, along with a notebook that detailed every single vehicle she'd, and quote, seized, and quote, over the last 3 years. She'd actually been stupid enough to keep a ledger of her crimes, thinking she was so untouchable that no one would ever dare to look in her purse. The day of the emergency HOA meeting was the first time I'd ever seen the community center full. People were standing in the aisles, leaning against the walls, and the air was thick with a mixture of fury and absolute relief. Diane wasn't Oppos. T there. She was being arraigned on felony charges of evidence tampering, grand theft, and conspiracy, and Chloe was facing a mountain of reckless driving and larceny charges that her, and quote, anxiety card, and quote, wasn't an Oppos. T going to fix. I stood at that podium, and I didn't an Oppos. TL, I didn't an Oppos. T even sound angry. I just read the ledger entries out loud, name by name, vehicle by vehicle, until the room was a roar of voices demanding the entire board into Oppos. S resignation. We voted them out right there, a unanimous wave of hands that felt like a long overdue exorcism. And for the first time since I moved in, I looked at my neighbors and didn't and Oppos. TC people afraid of their own lawns. I saw a community. It's been 6 months now. The Raptor is back in my garage, fully repaired by an insurance company that went after Diane's assets with a vengeance. And the neighborhood is different. It's louder. There are more bird feeders, more kids playing in the street, and the silence ISN and Oppos. T-heavy anymore. It's just peaceful. I still think about that morning sometimes, the sound of that scream and the sight of that stroller, and it reminds me that the most dangerous people aren't in Oppos. T always the ones hiding in shadows. Sometimes they're the ones holding a clipboard and wearing a, and quote, president, and quote, badge. But it also taught me that power is a fragile thing. It only lasts as long as people are willing to be afraid. And once you realize that a bully is just a person with a loud voice and a lot of insecurity, they lose their grip pretty fast. What would you have done if you saw your property being driven away by the person who's supposed to be, in quote, protecting, in quote, your neighborhood? And do you think a person like Diane can ever really be, in quote, rehabilitated, in quote? Or is that kind of entitlement something that's baked into the bone? I'd love to hear if you've ever had a run-in with a local, in quote, monarch, in quote, who thought they own the air you breathe. So drop a comment below, and let's talk about whether the HOA system is actually broken or if it's just the people we put in charge of it. If this story made you want to go check your garage locks, hit that like button and share it with someone who's currently fighting their own, in quote, Diane, in quote, and Don and Oppos. Forget to subscribe for more stories where the little guy finally gets to turn the lights on the cockroaches.